It's nearing 10:45 p.m, July 25th, 1956. A choking fog has settled over the ocean off the coast of Nantucket. In cabin 4M on board the MS Stockholm, a 22-year-old crewman named Bill Johnson is too busy concentrating to fall asleep. American-born, but with proud Swedish heritage, Bill is bound for the Swedish city of Lund via Gothenburg for a grant study program with his wife Carol and their 5-week-old daughter in tow. He has managed to snag a job on the ship washing glassware, a bit of money and experience before he starts school. Forever the overachiever, Bill is excited to study in his homeland, but he's the first one to admit that his Swedish could do with a little scrubbing up. The jewel of the Swedish-American line, Stockholm, had only left New York in the morning. For the first night, with his family in a passenger cabin, Bill wastes no time dusting off his childhood language when he learns that his 30-year-old roommate, Alf Johansson, is a native speaker. Bill perches on a chair in their cramped cabin, listening intently, furrowing his brow in concentration as he searches for the right words, while Alf reclines in the lower bunk, offering gentle corrections. The young men are not to know it as they chat, though, preoccupied, but Stockholm is motoring north of her recommended eastbound route at rather a quick pace. This is on order from Captain Harry Nordenson to hopefully cut back on travel time. But they're edging through the Times Square of the North Atlantic, a passage named as such because of busy westbound and eastbound traffic, and, during the summer, often a fog so thick that someone on deck may not be able to see their hand in front of their own face, let alone, say, another ship 2 miles or 3 kilometres away. For Stockholm's 572 passengers and 208 crew, the first night so far is business as usual. Bill and Alf talk in their cabin, others read to their children, and card sharks, liking their chances, settle in for another deal. But any experienced mariner knows that the fog is no one's friend. Stockholm will not make it to Europe without an unexpected meeting. The 697-foot, 212-metre long Andrea Doria, an Italian liner more like a floating art gallery crammed with 1,134 passengers, 572 crew, and countless works of priceless art, is inching closer and closer. But all of this is completely unknown to both ships. Bill continues listening to Alf as his eyes grow heavy with sleep. He pushes on, keen to practice his Swedish into the early hours of the morning, but he has no idea that this is the last time he'll ever speak to his new friend. When she was launched in 1948, the MS Stockholm was a clash of superlatives. As the largest passenger ship that had ever been built in Sweden, yet the smallest transatlantic liner on the run. Despite being a key player in one of the golden ages of transatlantic travel, her name is often associated with tragedy. She was involved in the first ever televised maritime disaster when she collided with the Andrea Doria, Italy's exquisite floating gallery. But Stockholm's story is much more than just a collision. Hers is a story of repair, world firsts, and extreme makeover. Her career demonstrates that after the dust settles, disaster ships may have a little more life left in them yet. Beating the odds, Stockholm would sail for not another 30 or 50, but another jaw-dropping 77 years. She would continue to inspire awe and affection from admirers and amass a cult following, beloved as the world's oldest actively sailing passenger liner and cruise ship. What happens to ships after disaster strikes? After the media storm quietens down and people try to move on, can these giants of the oceans shed the battle scars of tragedy and emerge reborn and anew? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Ocean Liner Designs, and this is the first in our new series, Disaster Ships, on a video topic suggested by channel supporter Garrett Bays 6942 and chosen by the members and patrons. We'll start with the story of a truly infamous disaster ship that is so much more than the tragedy that made her infamous. She's the longest-serving ocean liner ever built. She's Sweden's transatlantic titan, the MS Stockholm. 1946, and the war is over, even when battling the lingering effects like mass displacement of people, collapsed buildings and food shortages. Londoners still tightly hang on to food coupons to buy items like meat, sugar and tea. But safe passenger travel across the Atlantic is possible once again. And for many eager to shed the reminders of wartime devastation and great suffering, this means a chance to take a gamble, a shot at a new life. By the mid-1950s, more than 50 passenger liners circulate between Europe and North America, enabling trade, migration and globalization. In a sense, a great bridge between two continents. Everyone from immigrants to holidaymakers to businessmen are lapping up the golden age of transatlantic travel post-war. Passengers grip Samsonite suitcases and bid farewell to loved ones for only a sojourn or indefinitely, with a wave of handkerchiefs and flowing tears. Voyages on a Cunard liner, for example, were more akin to floating party, with many a celebrity sighting. Keep watch for the chairman of the board, Frank Sinatra himself. And MS Stockholm cruised among these giants, transporting passengers from Gothenburg, Sweden, to New York and back again. But jumping back to the last few months of the war, Sweden had been busy planning to beat everyone to the punch when transatlantic passenger travel resumed. Sweden's wartime neutrality was a safety blanket and, unlike her European neighbours scrambling to rebuild after mass destruction and devastation, her post-war years were marked by constant trading and immense social welfare reform. They had time and they had money on their side. The Swedish-American line was looking for a new star transatlantic liner, as they had lent the original MS Stockholm to the Italians in 1941, but she was unfortunately hit during an air raid and sunk. As we know, there would be more sour Swedish-Italian relations to follow soon, particularly when ocean liners were concerned, and it would prove just as disastrous. Anticipating having to compete with air travel, the Swedish-American line went against the grain somewhat and proposed a smaller, more modern ocean liner. She would still boast a dignified and smart atmosphere, but with greater warmth and intimacy to cater for all ages and walks of life. And so came the start of MS Stockholm, a 525-foot, 160-metre long multi-purpose passenger cargo liner, coming in at 11,000 gross tonnes and with a supremely strong ice-reinforced hull. Cargo and up to 400 passengers, more than half in tourist class, would fill her hull. Her keel was laid down at the Götaverken shipyard in Gothenburg in April 1945, as VE Day fever swept across the continent after Germany's surrender. The Swedes really were ahead of the game. A few years later, in February 1948, the Stockholm set off to the Big Apple on her maiden voyage, albeit a little bit rocky thanks to a lack of stabilizers. She was a handsome ship. Utilitarian, sure, but elegant, with a nice curving sheer that gave her a sleek appearance and a gorgeous modern silhouette, sporting a tall mast above the bridge and a single streamlined funnel. Perhaps spoiling the look a bit was the forest of cargo handling derricks and king posts that cluttered the upper works, but there was no doubt about it. Stockholm was a vessel for a new and rejuvenated Sweden. With two single-acting Götaverken diesel engines, she could reach a service speed of 19 knots and comfortably make it across the Atlantic in around 9 days. Not a record-setting run by any means, but more like a comfortable trot. On the bridge, a gyro compass, complete with repeater system, would give more accurate steering, bearing and direction control. Crucially, the new liner featured a radar set, which, although primitive by today's standards, was a huge step up because at least now the crew could see through the fog that frequently clouds the waterways off the US East Coast. But despite her shining status as one of the world's first post-war transatlantic liners, the Swedish-American Line branch in New York wasn't that eager to roll out the red carpet for her arrival. With a wave of upturned noses and shrugs, they were indifferent to Stockholm because they'd asked for a bigger liner. The company's new star was about 190 feet or 57 metres shorter than Cunard's swanky transatlantic vessel Coronia, introduced in 1947, which was itself less than half the size of the big liners Britain had been building before the war, like Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. And while Coronia was more like a large private yacht, a British country estate at sea for the mink and diamond set, Stockholm offered much simpler, more humble interior accommodations. Expectations at the New York Swedish-American Line had been for a larger liner, so Stockholm didn't make much of a splash. But all the same, she entered the transatlantic run boldly. Comfort rather than luxury was prioritised in her design, or so said the line's managing director, G.H. Lundebeck Jr. He promised passengers that instead of sumptuous and elaborate decoration, they would find more stress on air and light, and harmonious colours in textiles. Stockholm's interiors may not have been as majestic as Coronia's, but they still achieved Lundebeck's goals. The first-class lounge was right at the front of the curving superstructure and featured floor-to-ceiling timber panelling and plush sofas. Public rooms and passenger staterooms extended across 6 decks, and, aside from the usual smoking rooms, passengers could enjoy reading and writing rooms and veranda cafes across both classes. For the athletic passenger, there was an indoor swimming pool and massage rooms. But probably the key element to Stockholm's design was the impression of light. The exposed upper decks were clear of vents and equipment, giving passengers lots of room to stretch their legs and sunbathe. Meanwhile, children and adults alike may have squealed in excitement or slight fear, depending on their fondness for the ocean, because every cabin, regardless of class, had a porthole or a window. There were no dreary inside cabins whatsoever. Works by Swedish artist Kurt Ljungstedt lined the walls in the lounges and staircases, and grooming could be attended to in the barber or the beauty parlour. Of course, the ship's home nation was proud of their new creation. Stockholm's shiny white hull was capped by that tall yellow funnel, showing the round blue shield and 3 golden crowns of Sweden. Stockholm was in demand, and she proved a popular liner for Swedes and other Europeans looking to get over to the US, who weren't in a big rush. Even then, her comfortable interiors and relatively small size made her feel intimate, and she developed a regular following. As demand for ocean liner passenger travel continued to boom into the 1950s, Stockholm expanded her accommodation to cater for 584 tourist-class passengers, carting thousands of tourists and migrants on grand voyages across the Atlantic. But this would all change in the summer of 1956. As it heated up in the Northern Hemisphere, teenagers, high off Elvis Presley's swoon-worthy crooning and talent for gyrating, were promised rock and roll-soaked fun. Melbourne, in Australia, prepared to be the first country in the Southern Hemisphere to host the Olympics, and to televise the Games to boot. In other news, our friend Bill was busy networking his way onto Stockholm to travel to summer school across the pond in style. And the cruel combination of warm currents and frosty water would soon make for one of the most tragic summer's nights in transatlantic history. There is plenty of nighttime activity aboard the magnificent Italian liner Andrea Doria. As the clock nears 10:45 p.m, passengers in one of the ship's theatres settle in to watch the pearl-clutching melodrama Foxfire, and in the boat deck Belvedere Lounge, an orchestra provides a stunning soundscape to mingling and dancing. Others retire for the night, others put their children to bed. In cabin 52, 14-year-old Linda Morgan, a long way from her home in Mexico City, sleeps soundly next to her half-sister Joan. The ship has been battling fog since around 3 p.m, close to the Nantucket lightship, which prompted Captain Piero Calamai, a veteran of 40 years, to order a small reduction in speed to 21.8 knots. He also orders the watertight doors closed and for his ship's foghorn to blow a 6-second-long blast every 1 minute and 40 seconds. On top of that, additional lookouts have been posted to watch for any approaching ships. But if Captain Calamai is worried about the fog, he doesn't show it. He places faith in his experience and his crew's astute eye to get his ship to New York by early morning. But at 10:45 p.m, Andrea Doria realizes they're not alone. On their radar, they can see Stockholm, about 17 nautical miles or 31 kilometers away. And only a few minutes later, Andrea Doria is picked up on Stockholm's radar. There isn't too much cause for concern, but it wouldn't be known for another 25 minutes that the two ships are approaching each other and neither is following the rules of the road. According to those standards, if two ships are approaching each other, both must navigate so they pass port to port, or left to left. Stockholm's third officer, Johan Ernst Carstens Johansson, only 26 years old, plots the Andrea Doria to his left, preparing his ship to make the agreed-upon port-to-port manoeuvre, but Captain Calamai, plotting Stockholm to his right, decides to steer his ship to make a starboard-to-starboard move. One of these two men, and among certain circles today it is still disagreed exactly who, has misread their radar. Carol, Bill's wife, sits in her cabin on Stockholm and hums to a faint tune. In her sleepy stupor, she's thinking she can hear the orchestra playing Arrivederci Roma. But this doesn't make much sense, she thinks. Stockholm has just left the States, not Europe. Why would they be playing this song? Puzzled, and out of curiosity, she dips her head and looks out her porthole. Her eyes widen in horror. Out of thin air, at 11:10 p.m, Captain Calamai spots the lights of the Stockholm, still blanketed by heavy fog. He orders Andrea Doria hard over to the left. On Stockholm, young Carstens has reversed his engines in an attempt to slow down, but it's too late. 1 minute later, an almighty and gut-wrenching crash. With Stockholm's reinforced bow, a deadly weapon made to tear easily through ice, plunging 30 feet, 9 meters, into Andrea Doria's starboard side, like a hot knife through butter. On Stockholm, a death-dealing force is felt in cabin 4M, where Bill is tossed violently off his chair. He hears someone call out "iceberg" before he's knocked clean out. Alf disappears behind a wave of falling debris and sparks. In the Belvedere Lounge on the Andrea Doria, musicians fly off the stage. Glassware crashes at people's feet and tables are jerked upwards from sockets. The first-class cabins are a mess. Passengers are flung around their rooms like rag dolls. Staterooms are crushed. A colonel tumbles out of the bathroom on impact to find that his wife and first-class cabin have simply completely vanished. Cries of agony from other passengers fill his ears. Stockholm's bow remains in the Doria's side for a few moments before breaking loose, leaving a gaping hole on the Italian liner's flank. But the Stockholm would take on a new passenger as it reverses out. With the force of the collision, Linda Morgan, who'd been on Andrea Doria, had been scooped up and catapulted into the air. She lands, still on her mattress and with her mangled autograph book next to her, on the deck of the Stockholm. She jolts awake in fright and begins wailing incoherently for her mother in Spanish. Miraculously, a Spanish crewman overhears her cries in his native tongue and thinks it's very odd on a Swedish ship. He runs to her and attempts to calm her down. "I was on the Andrea Doria, where am I now?" she says over and over. On the same ship, Bill comes to after losing consciousness and gazes around, his head pounding, at a destroyed cabin. He can't see Alf anywhere. He screams out for help and thankfully crew members rush to his aid. But they haven't even had time to do a lifeboat drill yet. About 5 minutes have passed since the collision and the crews of both ships are assessing the damage. Stockholm's bow is badly crumpled, but she is in no danger of sinking. The Andrea Doria, however, is listing 20 degrees to starboard. The crew also discover the 8 lifeboats on her port side can't be launched. She can now only evacuate about 1,000 passengers and crew, leaving hundreds without a means to escape. People on deck clutch rubber cushions from chairs in lieu of life jackets, and a chorus of prayers and panicked screams fill the intensely foggy air. At 11:20 p.m, the Andrea Doria begs nearby ships for assistance. Fortunately, after sealing off their crushed bow section, the Stockholm begins to take on survivors herself. And these are busy waters after all. Friendly vessels of all shapes and sizes responds to the call of help, rivaling that almost of the Dunkirk evacuation. Luxury liners, Gloucester fishing boats, coastal steamers, oil tankers, all rose to the challenge, the New York Times later reported. Even Cape Ann, a 7,000-ton freighter, was there. But the arrival of the Ile-de-France, about 2 hours after the collision, would prove the most memorable. She would take on 745 survivors, many of them wounded. With her arrival, passengers on the Andrea Doria get desperate and drop children and babies into the waiting arms of sailors in lifeboats. By 5 a.m, Captain Calamai and a handful of crew are still on board Andrea Doria, trying to level her with auxiliary pumps. All survivors have now been populated onto various rescue ships. Captain Calamai is prepared to go down with his vessel, but his crew refuses to leave him until he finds the last lifeboat at 7 a.m. The final vessels in the rescue fleet make haste towards New York. At 10:09 a.m, the Andrea Doria capsizes and slides beneath the surface at about 40 miles southwest of Nantucket Island and 110 miles east of Montauk Point. Stockholm stayed with the Andrea Doria until she sank and sounded her own horn in respect of the great ship and those who had been lost. The official death toll would soon be recorded as 46 from the Italian liner and 5 from Stockholm, with many later dying from injuries and wounds. Bill, grateful to be reunited with his surviving family, looks high and low for Alf, but he would later learn that his new friend had died on the way to hospital. Linda, who the press would later herald as the miracle girl, would suffer from a broken arm, but she lost both her stepfather and stepsister. While those deaths were deeply tragic, there were nearly 2,500 passengers and crew between the two ships. It was a remarkable rescue effort, and Andrea Doria, although now at the bottom of the sea, had proved her seaworthiness. She was hit directly amidships by an ocean liner and still managed to stay afloat for nearly 11 hours. The damage from the Stockholm's bow had only breached one of her compartments, but it was right near her fuel tanks, which were fortunately almost empty thanks to her voyage being nearly complete. If Stockholm hadn't been able to stay afloat, or if the Andrea Doria had sunk at the rate of the Lusitania or Titanic, the death toll could have easily been in the thousands. It's a truly mind-boggling sight. These photographs show the Stockholm steaming back into New York with 545 survivors and a severely disfigured and deformed bow. It looks like a giant has taken a rough and angry bite out of her forward end and spat out the excess. You can only imagine the destruction on Andrea Doria if that weapon did the damage that looks like that. It had been another maritime night to remember. Captain Calamai, exhausted, yet attempting to appear composed and calm, stepped gingerly off the USS Edward H. Allen to hordes of journalists hungry for a statement. As tape recorders are shoved near his mouth, he procures a pen and paper and reads out a statement shakily. "We were hit last night," he said, "by the Swedish ship Stockholm. The damage was so great that it was necessary to disembark all passengers and crew. We have been helped brilliantly by the US Army, Navy, and Coast Guard." But the ordeal was far from over for Calamai, and he would reportedly never sail again. Like many households would find out a decade or so later during the Vietnam War, tragedy feels all the more real when it's televised as it's happening. The collision of the Andrea Doria and the Stockholm was the first maritime tragedy to reach TV as it was happening. Just before the Andrea Doria's sinking, CBS Evening News correspondent Douglas Edwards and producer Don Hewitt filmed the now 45-degree listed ship from directly above in a light aircraft. "She looks like a big and dead hippopotamus," Douglas said to his viewers, who were stunned into speechlessness in their living rooms. And it was shocking for so many who had placed their trust and faith in transatlantic liners to get them from continent to continent safely. In a stroke of the prophetic, Herbert Bayer, a professor in Admiralty law from the University of North Carolina, had apparently remarked to his wife only a few days before the tragedy, "It seems as if great disasters at sea are a thing of the past. We haven't had a Titanic in years." Well, Bayer humbly ate his own words, of course, but he would go on to study the ensuing court case with scrutiny and detail, and admitted what was on everyone's minds. The security of our life at sea was, despite our technical advances and codes of safety, still subject to misjudgment. Grief and pain ballooned for the lives and the possessions lost. Blame began to seesaw between the captains and, depending on who you talk to, it still does today. A few weeks later, the Swedish America Line filed suit in New York federal court and alleged Andrea Doria was responsible for the accident. And the Italian line filed suit in the very same court, but stated Stockholm was to blame. A standoff ensued. The inquiry was not conducted under the jurisdiction of the Coast Guard or Navy because it concerned foreign ships in global waters, which would come back to bite everyone involved. As numerous statements were taken from crew, passengers, and both captains, things just weren't adding up. Carstens from the Stockholm said the night was clear, but crew on the Doria and the Ile-de-France reported thick, heavy fog. Both vessels had sophisticated and robust radar systems, but according to Carstens, Andrea Doria was on her port side, whereas Captain Calamai reported Stockholm on the starboard side. Both ships were travelling at faster than usual speeds, so what on earth had gone wrong? It was an onerous situation and a back-and-forth blame game. Attorneys' fees were racking up into the millions, and it was heading towards one of the most expensive maritime settlements ever recorded. Captain Nordenson allegedly collapsed in the middle of a tiring cross-examination. After 6 months, out of desperation, attorneys decided to euthanize the case and decreed that a settlement would be the fairest way for families to gain closure and support. All third-party claims were settled under the terms of limitation of liability, meaning a potential total of $85 million in claims were settled for just 6. Despite not reaching an attribution of responsibility, and with a cloud of uncertainty and disagreement still hanging over the collision, it was settled. The Swedish America Line paid $4 million, which amounted to the value of Stockholm after the collision, into a joint liability fund, while the owners of the Andrea Doria, their ship being a total loss, paid just $400,000. And 3 years later, all thanks to Collision Course, a New York Times best-selling book by journalist Melvin Mosco, the accepted narrative was that the Andrea Doria was at fault. The book also painted a damning and unfavourable portrayal of the Italians, and this interpretation was quickly absorbed by the public, and it stuck for a long time. But shipwreck historian David A. Bright says the cause of the collision boils down to paper cuts of mistakes. Think of paper cuts like small errors that, if considered on their own, are innocuous and harmless, but when they're placed together, they can cause death by 1,000 cuts. Aviation disaster experts call it the Swiss cheese model. When all the holes line up, bad things happen. The Stockholm, the pride of the Swedish America Line, was stuck in a bit of an awkward position. It was stranded in a foreign port, and of course, it was missing its entire bow section. Although the Italian line, representing Andrea Doria, had initially agreed to pick up the tab for Stockholm's bow, it was Swedish America that decided to front the estimated $1 million repair cost. The Italian line, for their part, had enough on their plate dealing with the $30 million loss of the Andrea Doria. In early August, it was time for repairs, and Stockholm was hauled to the Bethlehem Steel Company in Brooklyn. It was a daunting rebuilding task, as the jewel of Swedish America Line had lost 75 feet of her bow, and steel plating buckled deep inside her hull, but those at the shipyard were up for the challenge. Almost 3 months later to the date, and $995,000 later, and a fair share of elbow grease, the ship's bow had been rebuilt, alongside the fitting of 16 new crew cabins. It was time for the moment of truth, and she was ready for a test run. With a small army of shipyard technicians and newspapermen on board, she travelled about 30 miles southeast of Ambrose Lightship for her trials. Over the course of 9 hours, as those nervous technicians watched on and muttered hopeful prayers, she tested out her navigational equipment and her new set of anchor windlasses. The trial run was under the watchful eye of Captain Sune Olsen, who commanded the ship twice before, who was pleased with her perfect handling and a maximum speed of 18 knots, and in premium visibility, the radar clocked ships easily up to 50 miles away. The technicians wiped their brows and breathed a sigh of relief. It had paid off. Stockholm had received a major and transformative facelift. She would be ready for a trip again a week or so later, where she would be Bermuda-bound under Captain Olsen for a 5-day cruise. It was an extraordinary return to form for a ship which had suffered horrendous damage, and she got back to work, but soon the impressive little ship that had beaten the odds was outclassed. Swedish America Line wanted to follow up on their success with Stockholm, and they built 2 magnificent liners that doubled her in size. Kungsholm had been introduced in 1953, and Gripsholm entered service in 1957. Now Stockholm was left as an unusual outlier in the fleet. Passengers who had got used to the 2 other ships' sprawling interiors found Stockholm no longer intimate, but cramped. That, and 1957 was the year transatlantic passenger jet travel overtook travel by sea for the first time in sheer passenger carrying. Feeling the pressure, and with Stockholm the weakest link, Swedish America Line put their tough little liner on the market after just 2 years.
Up at 5.5.
5
3/4. Do I hear any more? $6 for $10. Do I hear any more than $6?
Bidders came and went, but interest wasn't high. Stockholm was an awkwardly sized vessel, and none of the big carriers, who were starting to feel the pressure from jet travel, wanted her. Stockholm's unexpected saviour was the Soviet Union. East Germany was in fierce competition with the West, and locked in a desperate attempt to show that the Soviet way of life was the way of success. In reality, though, it was a failing state, and East Germans looked with envy at their Western neighbours who enjoyed luxuries they couldn't even access, let alone afford. In 1960, the ship was bought by the East German government and put under the management of the German Shipping Company for the Free German Trade Union Federation. That organization was one way the Soviet state could at least project the image of success. Hardworking members would be rewarded with spa visits and holidays. The Federation also chartered a small fleet of cruise ships where party members could enjoy visits to exotic destinations. Her new owners took charge of the old Swedish ship, and they got to work converting her, of course, into a one-class floating billboard for the Soviet way of life. On her bow was her new name, a mouthful for anybody outside of Germany, the Freundschaft, meaning international friendship, an almost tongue-in-cheek name for a vessel that had sunk another country's finest liner. But the newly refurbished ship underwent her first cruise to the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. One of her regular ports of call as a cruise ship was Havana. Freundschaft was actually on a cruise there when the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted. She had to break through the American blockade escorted by a destroyer. There can be no doubt, though, that exposing East Germans to the world outside their Soviet state made them ponder about life away from communist rule. Over her 24 years as an East German vessel, the ship would sometimes feature in newspaper headlines as crew and passengers would jump ship in order to avoid returning to the Soviet Union. But despite that, life aboard Freundschaft was fun, and the ship had an undeniable warmth. Her small size made it easy for comrades to feel bonded together, and it also made life easier for party informers keeping an ear out for dissident talk. It was smooth sailing until 1984, when the ship almost created an international incident after running straight into a submerged West German submarine. But by then, Freundschaft was 36 years old, and she was hemorrhaging money badly. The ship was put on the market once again, and this time the future looked bleak. 36 is already pretty old for a big passenger ship because its engines have travelled millions of miles, they've done countless millions of revolutions, and the hull has been battered by endless storms. But the vessel was bought by a holding company and put on ice in Southampton for a year, where she sat awaiting her fate. Plans for conversion fell through, and it seemed likely that Stockholm would be scrapped. But then fate once again intervened. Norway was undergoing a refugee crisis, with asylum seekers arriving in alarming numbers from Iran in the wake of the revolution, and Sri Lanka, which was in the depths of a brutal civil war. Desperate, the Norwegian government chartered her and renamed her Fridtjof Nansen. She made the voyage over to Oslo, but sadly she'd been at anchor for so long her engines were completely dilapidated and the ship had to be towed. Anchored in Oslo, she presented a rather sad sight, with a fading paintwork and streaking rust, but she served a few years as a floating accommodation ship for the refugees who arrived month after month. In 1989, the crisis had eased, and the old Stockholm at last seemed destined for the scrappers. Clapped out with a set of diesels that didn't work anymore and a by now ancient silhouette, she was again put on the market. But once more, fate would intervene in one of the greatest plot twists in maritime history. The ex-Stockholm found a buyer, an Italian buyer. Star Lauro Lines had found great success converting old European liners into cruise ships. They'd watched the former Stockholm with interest. Her small size meant operating and converting her would be relatively cheap, but fitting her out as a luxury cruise ship would attract clientele who were willing to pay top dollar for a more intimate experience. She was taken under tow in 1993 to where else but Genoa, Andrea Doria's home port, the very city she'd been registered to. The reception was understandably frosty. Italian newspapers called her the Ship of Death. But Star Lauro were keen to erase the sins of the past, and they got to work. First of all, she was given a suitably patriotic name to right all the wrongs, Italia, and then eventually Italia Prima. But that wasn't the only change. The former ocean liner was going to be completely rebuilt. She was gutted down right to the hull. Her superstructure was ripped clean off, and all the interiors were stripped back to bare steel. Chapella shipyard spared no expense, wasted no space on board. She was completely redesigned, and the ship that emerged in 1994 looked absolutely different. Small parts of the old Stockholm still remained. She still had that elegant sheer, the raked bow. Careful observation could pick out the rows of doubled-up portholes for the old dining saloon. There could be no hiding the hull's canning, the small indentations made in between frames from decades of the ship's skin being pounded by big waves. But here was an almost brand new cruise ship with interiors so different to Stockholm's there's actually no way to do a side-by-side comparison. The interiors were, for want of a better term, distinctly 1990s, but they were comfortable and they were elegant. Probably the best addition for a modern clientele was the extended after-deck space, complete with outdoor pool. The only unfortunate addition to the ship was a big duck-tailed sponson at the stern, a kind of bolted-on barge to help with pitching and rolling in rough seas. It definitely spoiled her classic lines, but at least passengers could drink their soup without it spilling into their laps in a swell. Italia Prima was after the luxury German cruise market, and she operated under charter as a 4.5-star ship, completing an inaugural round-the-world voyage in 1997. The little cruise ship was popular, but she still bounced between owners and charters like a ping-pong ball, and her stint as Italia Prima was short-lived. In 2002, in the new millennium, she became the Caribe and then the Athena in 2005, as her ownership was passed on to a Portuguese firm. Under that guise, in 2006, the ship was caught in a horror cyclone after leaving England bound for Canada on a 24-day cruise. For 2 days straight, the little ship was battered and thrown about. A 70-year-old passenger, a retired doctor, fell down a staircase and died. The weather was so bad, passengers had been asked not to move around the ship and to stay put in their cabins. They almost mutinied, and fair enough too. The Athena had to call right away into Nova Scotia. It was under this rather ignominious venture that the former Stockholm rumbled into New York Harbour once more, the place where 50 years earlier she had arrived, missing her bow, having sent Andrea Doria to the bottom. In 2008, drama struck once again. On a cruise in the Gulf of Aden, the ship was swarmed by nearly 30 small boats full of pirates who tried to board and hijack the ship. The crew mustered and fired high-pressure hoses at the pirates who struggled to clamber up that tall hull, and the attack was fended off. In 2013, she was renamed Azores, but after a brief refreshing, her new operators collapsed. More than a few times, the ship was stranded thanks to unpaid fuel bills and taxes. In 2016, she was renamed once again for the final time, Astoria, and she operated under charter by a French tour company. By then, Astoria had earned a reputation as a survivor. She had outlived Swedish America Line, the Soviet Union, and virtually every other operator that had bought or chartered her until then. She was nearing 70 years old, an incredible age for any ship, let alone a constantly serving passenger vessel. She had survived collisions, storms, bankruptcy. She had a dedicated cult following around the world, not just of passengers who booked every season to occupy the ship that was so familiar to them it was virtually an extension of their living room, but to ship history nerds like me, who just love to see this most unlikely of all survivors continue on. We thought she'd go on forever. One by one, the great ocean liners who had been converted just like her began to be scrapped. She even outlived the Swedish America ships that had been built to replace her back in the 50s. But, like a super centenarian who has lived so long, they've witnessed the passing of friends, family, rivals, loves, and competitors alike, by 2019, only Astoria was left. The last of a unique breed of ship. Her owners, CMV, intended to give her one last season, and the ship set off in early 2020, but then there came a blow that not even the old Stockholm could survive.
As of this morning, March 13th, CDC is reporting more than 1,500 cases of COVID-19.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought the global cruise industry to an immediate grinding halt. Cruise ships that had been across the globe raced for home at full speed and then sat mothballed for weeks, then months, then years. Sitting idly is the worst thing for a big ship. Machinery rusts. Soft furnishings like carpet and curtains begin to mould and rot. The Astoria was abandoned by her crew who rushed for home, seized by the UK government and then towed to Rotterdam for auction. The asking price was just £10 million, but she sat, unwanted, into 2021. A plan to convert her into a 5-star floating hotel was dashed when she broke loose of her moorings and smashed into a container ship. Maybe it was just Stockholm's way of saying she was tired and ready to go. In June 2025, she was at last purchased, not by a shipping company, but by a scrapper. Towed to Belgium, the old Astoria was moored for dismantling. As I say this, she's tied up in Ghent, being stripped and cut apart. The artwork inside the ship, including elaborate stained glass, paintings, murals, and ceramics, they've mostly been trashed and lost forever. Astoria's true value is in her steel skeleton and her copper wiring. Everything else is just simply in the way. It's going to probably take a while. The company is eager to reverse the trend of harmful and improper ship dismantling, which usually leads to the release of asbestos and oil into surrounding waters. We need to shout out Peter Nego for this fantastic and rare footage of Astoria in her final years. He's got dozens of videos of ocean liners and classic cruise ships on his channel, and I'll include a link in the description and the pinned comment. Over the last year, enthusiasts have arrived in Ghent to pay their respects to a ship that looks like the husk of her former self. It's a sad loss, but eventually every ship will need to be scrapped one way or another. Cruise ships nowadays are getting bigger and bigger as operators seek to cash in on volume. Astoria hails from a different time and place, when small cruise ships gave a cozy environment and they fostered strong bonds between groups of travellers. We'll probably not see their like again. Despite her name being tangled up in disaster and having lost her entire bow section, the Stockholm went on to achieve the near impossible. She was rebuilt, and her sheer resilience and strength made for a 70-year-long career. In her heyday, she was the pride and joy of the Swedish America line. She earned a coveted spot in the golden age of post-war transatlantic travel, when people were propelled forward into the unknown in search of adventure, change, or simply a new start. She outlived competitors and owners, housed the wealthy jet set, excited Soviets, war-weary refugees, and tourists from across the world. Hers is a truly global story, but in 2026, that story finally comes to an end. In 2020, as the Astoria's fate was up in the air, there came a curious bit of news. A New Jersey-based dive team, Atlantic Wreck Salvage, operating from the DV Tenacious, happened upon a twisted tangle of metal off the US East Coast. An anchor and a windlass, shattered portholes and twisted steel. It was the bow of a once great Swedish liner, the Stockholm, lying on the bottom, covered in algae and grime and decades of rust. But incredibly, although it had sat there rusting and rotting for 6 decades, the ship it had once been attached to had lived a long and happy life.